be Arizonans. And we're fortunate to witness what we have witnessed in the past couple of weeks. And, Mr. President, I'm pleased to help bring this resolution to honor these men to the floor, and I yield the floor.
The senator from Arizona.
President, first of all, I want to thank the senator from Delaware for his kind words about me and my friend and colleague from Arizona, who I believe is carrying on in the fine tradition of his predecessor, Senator Kyl, in a spirit of bipartisanship and dedication to the people of Arizona. I come to the floor today with my colleague from Arizona to offer a resolution honoring the fallen heroes of the Granite Mountain Interagency Hotshot Crew. Yesterday, Senator Flake and I were privileged to attend a memorial ceremony in Prescott, Arizona, honoring the service and sacrifice of the 19 brave men of the Granite Mountain Hotshots who lost their lives last week battling the Yarnell Hill fire in Yavapai County, Arizona. I know I speak for all of my fellow citizens in expressing our gratitude for the Vice President of the United States, who came all the way to Arizona and gave a moving and stirring and wonderful testimony to these brave Arizonans. And I believe it's typical of my friend for so many years, the Vice President of the United States, who he and his wonderful wife would come to Arizona to join us in our efforts to honor these brave men. These were not men merely worth knowing. They were men to admire. They were men to emulate if you have the courage and character to live as decently and honorably as they lived. Not many of us can. But we can become better people by trying to be half as true, half as brave, half as good as they were, and to make our lives, too, count for something more than the sum of our days. The news accounts of their lives and the testimonials to their virtues that have appeared in the days since we lost them give the rest of us a glimpse of what a blessed memory they are to those who knew and loved them. Some of them were the sons of firefighters who grew up wanting to be like Dad, their hero. Some leave behind wives and children. Some were expecting the birth of their first child. Some married their high school sweethearts. Some were engaged and looking forward to being husbands and fathers. Two were cousins and best friends. One rescued horses. One aspired to preach the Word of God. One was a standout ball player. One dressed in a yellow raincoat when he was 6 and pretended to put out fires. Some were born in Arizona. Some came from other places and fell right in love with the beauty and people of Arizona. Some were shy. Others were practical jokers. They were all respected and admired, the kind of men who you just liked being around. They all loved the outdoors. They were athletic and adventurous. They loved their jobs. They wanted to serve others. They wanted to make a difference. They all had a purpose greater than themselves. They were all young, so young. They were all brave, so brave. They were all loved and were loved, so loved. And they will all be missed, so terribly missed. I will forever be touched by what their families and friends have told me about them and how much they meant to them and their communities. Their stories teach us how to be better people. Their loss reminds us to hold each other a little tighter, to love each other a little harder. I will always consider myself disadvantaged for not having known them. From the little I know about hope in the face of daunting challenge and the indomitability of the human spirit that is so vital to helping us keep our faith and to endure, I hope I can offer some solace when I say the courage of those who we honor today is immortal. The it does not perish with them. How they lived and what they did will inspire others to live courageously, purposefully, selflessly. Of these qualities, we tend to see merely flashes throughout our lives. In these brave men of the Granite Mountain hotshots, we see grand examples, sublime, shining, and unforgettable examples that will summon good men and women today and long after our time has passed to live bravely and compassionately and honorably. In a fierce and terrifying encounter with extreme danger, they stood their ground like the heroes they were and fought for their community. While they did not come home to the people who loved them so much and will miss them always, I firmly believe we will see them again in the better world that is to come. Until then, we fondly remember the humanity and the heroism of these brave men, their wonderfully unassuming, down-to-earth nature, all of their marvelous imperfections known only to their closest family and friends, and how in the face of dire peril, they rose beyond all that makes us merely ordinary and let God cradle them in his arms and carry them away. The lost men of the Granite Mountain hotshots died having taught us all how to live, and for that, as we honor them and pay our respects to their loved ones today, I should submit we should all find great solace. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the consideration of S.Res. 193 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 193, honoring the fallen heroes of the Granite Mountain Interagency Hotshot Crew.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will so proceed.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk.
Mr. President, I note the absence of the quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Corey Bowles is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Senate Democrats that have offered a proposal to roll back the student loan interest rate to 3.4%. As you know, it doubled to 6.8% effective July 1st. How much support does that proposal to roll back the rates have?
Well, it has almost no support amongst Republicans and, frankly, limited support amongst Democrats. There are a number of folks on the liberal side of the Democratic caucus who do support this one-year rollback to where rates were until the beginning of this month. Their argument being that what they want is Congress to do a proper overhaul of federal government policy for the higher education sphere. And as part of that, they would hope that they would address this loan rate issue on a more permanent basis. The problem is that they're running into the simple fact of the matter that rates have now doubled, and as I say, there's little consensus as to what they should do in the short term about those rates. Now, there's another plan that's floating around that has bipartisan support. On the Democratic side of the aisle, you have Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Tom Carper of Delaware, and then independent Senator Angus King of Maine. They're working with an equal number of Republicans to concoct a plan that would see some rates go up, other rates go down, but what they see as a more market-based solution to the loan debacle. That plan would be more in keeping with what the House Republicans passed earlier in the year and what the President proposed in his budget back in February. Unfortunately, that plan doesn't seem to have enough support amongst Democrats to be voted through the Senate yet. So what we really have is a kind of dueling plan situation where it's not evident yet what votes are going to occur for which plan when. There's a lot of talk that we could see some action later this week, and not clear yet what exactly is going to happen there. But I think what's most interesting about the situation is, in contrast to last year, where there was a real sense of urgency that this had to get done before July 1st, and of course there was a very large political dynamic going on there. This year, the July 1st deadline came and went, and there's really little sense of urgency. Rates have now doubled for a lot of students taking out new loans, and every day that nothing is done, you know, the students taking out new loans are paying higher interest rates, and yet there's no sign of really any immediate solution to this quandary.
Oh, the Democrats, let's go back to the Democrats' plan. How much money would it cost the federal government to do it for just 1 year, and where does that money come from to finance it?
Democrats would take money from mind freeze for a second. The Democratic plan would the key thing for them is they don't want to add to the deficit as part of their plan. The other plans out there, the Republican plan in the House and the bipartisan one that has been negotiated between the senators I mentioned a moment ago, that would add to the deficit. And Democrats, especially liberal-leaning Democrats, have argued that they're essentially seeking to help balance the federal budget on the back of students, and they argue that that's not an appropriate way. So what they would do is they would take money from tax credits available to other entities, and they would use that money to pay for their short-term fix.
Now, the Republican bill has attracted some support from Democrats. Who's in sync with that bill, and why are they going against their party on the issue?
Well, I think you've got folks that I mentioned, some centrist people like Messrs. Carper, Manchin, and King, who they don't see it as going against their party as much as they see it as an area where there can be bipartisan cooperation. Not exactly a concept that's happening in droves up here on the Hill these days. So they don't see it as necessarily voting or going against their party, especially considering that their plan is fairly similar to that which President Barack Obama outlined in his budget request to Congress earlier in the year. What they see it as is a more realistic long-term fix to what essentially was put in place as a short-term solution a few years ago. Their plan would link the rates that new loans are taken out to long-term interest rates paid by the federal government, or sorry, charged to the federal government, and what they view as a plan that would fix the problem once and for all, as opposed to these kind of short-term, year-long extensions we've started to see of late.
What has the administration had to say about this?
Frankly, very little publicly. They talk in broad generalities about the president's plan released in his budget earlier in the year. They talk about the desire to see a solution fixed. They talk about the desire to see the parties come together. But what we haven't seen is any really senior administration officials talk in public right now as to what specifically they want to see happen. We hear from our sources that behind the scenes, the administration is giving support to the liberal-leaning Democrats in the Senate who want to do the one-year extension. At the same time, they recognize, of course, that there's not enough support to get that done right now. So what Democratic aides are telling me, Democratic leadership aides are telling me, is they want to know with greater clarity what the White House wants to see happen right now. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid today, when speaking to reporters, mentions that he is seeking a meeting with the White House Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, as well as Arne Duncan, the Education Secretary. I gather that would be an opportunity to get a better sense as to where the administration is and how hard they're going to push for their solution to be realized.
Corey Bowles is a congressional reporter for the Wall Street Journal. We appreciate your being with us.
Ms. Ayat. Ms. Baldwin.
The senator from Utah,
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
without objection.
Mr. President, 23 years ago, I stood here on the Senate floor as we voted 91-6 for the conference report on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I predicted that this landmark piece of legislation would literally unlock the resources of individuals with disabilities that had previously been wasted. I worked long and hard to get it enacted into law. It was one of the bills that I feel most appreciative of. And in 2008, I again stood here on the Senate floor as we passed the ADA Amendments Act by unanimous consent. I said that it was part of our ongoing effort to expand opportunities for individuals with disabilities and to help them participate in the American dream. I remain committed to that effort. Both of these legislative achievements were the result of negotiation and compromise, and they directly addressed and provided concrete solutions for problems faced by American citizens. We should address such public policy issues through the legislative process so that elected representatives make the decisions that affect Americans and are consequently accountable to them. Mr. President, there is underway an effort to promote the rights and opportunities of persons with disabilities through a treaty rather than through legislation. Advocates of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD, appear to believe that statutes and treaties are simply alternative means to accomplish the same end. Though I have labored with these advocates on disability legislation, I must respectfully but firmly disagree. My record on disability legislation speaks for itself, but I cannot support the CRPD because the cost to American sovereignty and self-government clearly outweighs any concrete benefit to Americans. When Alexander Hamilton explained the American system of representative self-government, he famously said that in America, quote, "the people govern. Here they act by their immediate representatives," unquote. Those words today are inscribed above an entrance to the House of Representatives in the Capitol, a building that Thomas Jefferson described as, quote, "dedicated to the sovereignty of the people," unquote. That sovereignty certainly includes the authority to elect representatives and the authority of those representatives to enact laws. But it is much more than that. The American people also have authority to define our culture, express our values, set our priorities, and balance the many competing interests that exist in a free society. To put it simply, the American people must have the last word. The CRPD would undermine that sovereignty, compromise self-government, and give the last word to the United Nations. Let me explain how. The CRPD is not a treaty with other nations, but a treaty with the United Nations itself. Ratifying it would create a wide range of obligations for the United States and authorize the United Nations to determine whether we are meeting those obligations. The UN website says that the CRPD legally binds any nation ratifying it to adhere to its principles. The treaty applies those principles in more than 24 areas of national life, including education, health, employment, accessibility, and independent living, as well as participation in political, public, and cultural life. Article 8 even requires ratifying nations to, quote, "raise awareness throughout society, including at the family level, regarding persons with disabilities," unquote. The treaty also spells out what adherence to its principles in these many areas will require. Ratifying nations must enact, modify, or abolish not only laws and regulations at all levels of government, federal, state, and local, but also social customs and cultural practices. Ratifying nations must refrain from engaging in any acts or practices that are inconsistent with the treaty, as well as ensure that all public authorities and institutions act
in conformity with it. The heart of the CRPD is a committee of 18 experts elected by the nations ratifying the treaty that has authority to determine if those nations are in compliance. Each nation must submit to this committee periodic, comprehensive reports on measures taken to meet the obligations imposed by the treaty. The UN committee dictates the content of these reports, evaluates whether a nation is in compliance, and makes whatever recommendations it so chooses. I commend to senators an article co-authored by our former colleague from Arizona, Jon Kyl, and published in the current issue of the Journal of Foreign Affairs. He explains well how international law can undermine democratic sovereignty. Of this particular treaty, the CRPD, he writes, quote, "If the treaty has a practical effect, it would be due in large part to interpretations made by foreign government officials and judges and by non-governmental organizations, none answerable to American voters," unquote. Under the U.S. Constitution, ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. Since the United States has long had the most progressive disability laws and policies in the world, we likely are already doing much that the CRPD requires, but that is not the point, and instead highlights the real problem. Ratifying the CRPD would endorse an official ongoing role for the United Nations in evaluating virtually every aspect of American life. Ratifying the CRPD would say that the United Nations, not the American people, has the final say about whether the United States is meeting its obligations in many areas. And it would impose this cost to American sovereignty and self-government with no real concrete benefit to Americans. Ratifying the CRPD will not establish a single right for a single American. It will not provide for Americans with disabilities anything that American law has not or could not provide. It would not even help Americans with disabilities who travel overseas because their treatment depends on the laws and policies of other countries, not ours. The CRPD's combination of obligations and UN oversight can help move nations that have not done so on their own toward protecting the rights and promoting the opportunities of persons with disabilities. That, I take it, is the strategic purpose of the treaty. But the United States is not only far down that road, we literally blazed the trail. And I was a significant part of blazing that trail. Treaty advocates argue that the CRPD's impact on American sovereignty and self-government can be minimized by the many caveats that would accompany ratification. These are commonly referred to as reservations, understandings, and declarations. The legal status of these caveats, however, is unclear. The CRPD itself states that, quote, "Reservations incompatible with the object and purpose of the CRPD shall not be permitted," unquote. A judgment reserved to the UN committee. No less an authority than Harold Koh, former State Department legal advisor, now Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale, has questioned whether such declarations have, quote, "either domestic or international legal effect," unquote. Treaty advocates also emphasize that the UN committee will have no formal authority to interfere domestically in the United States. But as I explained, American sovereignty and self-government are not so narrow that they can be undermined only if we literally let the United Nations run our country. The UN and its components hardly need a treaty to opine on aspects of American life or public policy. They already do so, and we've seen it many times. It is, however, something else entirely for the United States formally to endorse the UN's right to do so and subject ourselves to their evaluation. Treaty advocates say that ratifying the CRPD would give the United States a, quote, "seat at the table," unquote, to promote the rights and opportunities of persons with disabilities around the world. Ratifying the CRPD will neither create nor is necessary to maintain America's global leadership on behalf of persons with disabilities. We had the most progressive laws in the world decades before the CRPD existed. Individual nations, as well as the European Union, are today modeling their laws after ours, even without ratifying the treaty. The only table in this arena at which the United States doesn't already have a seat is the UN Disability Committee. But do the math. The committee has 18 members who are elected by the CRPD's state parties, currently 132 nations. The chances of the United States having a seat at that table at any particular time are remote. And will get even smaller as even more nations ratify the treaty. And besides, as I just noted, advocates acknowledge that the UN Committee has no formal authority anyway. Finally, treaty advocates say that United States ratification will encourage other nations to do so. But at least 19 nations on 4 continents, from Norway and Russian Federation to Barbados, Israel, and Liberia, have ratified the CRPD just since it was received here in the Senate a little more than a year ago. I have not addressed substantive issues with the CRPD as currently drafted, but I will mention just one. For more than 4 decades, American disability law and policy have used an objective, functional definition of disability. A disability is an impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. The CRPD, however, states that, quote, disability is an evolving concept, unquote, involving barriers that hinder, quote, full and effective participation on an equal basis with others, unquote. The threat to American sovereignty and self-government I have described would exist even if the CRPD utilized a similar concept of disability. But at least by the CRPD's terms, it appears that the UN Committee will use an evolving concept of disability to evaluate how the United States has implemented its objective concept of disability. There exists virtually nothing that the United States could do after ratification that it could not or does not already do today. The truth is that every argument for ratifying the CRPD applies properly to other countries, not to the United States. The only real benefit of ratification that I can see would be to endorse the principles and policy statements in the treaty. The United States, however, either already does so by law or can do so in ways that do not undermine our sovereignty and self-government. In the end, the most potent kind of leadership is the kind that America has exercised for decades already, taking real action to protect the rights and promote the opportunities of persons with disabilities. I remain as committed as ever to that ongoing responsibility. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
From Charleston, South Carolina, Mary Schiavo is the Transportation Department's Inspector General from 1990 through 1996, and here to talk about airline safety in light of the Asiana airline crash in San Francisco. Ms. Schiavo, let me just begin with showing our viewers what NTSB Chairman Deborah Hersman had to say at a press briefing yesterday in the middle of this ongoing investigation about the experience of the pilots.
The instructor pilot, this is the pilot who is seated in the right seat. He's also a captain. He reported to our investigators that his total flight time is 13,000 hours. He estimated he had about 3,000 hours in the 777. His total pilot in command time was about 10,000 hours. He had been in the Korean Air Force for 10 years. He reported that this was his first trip as an instructor pilot. The instructor pilot stated that he was the pilot in command. He was sitting in the right seat.
Mary Schiavo, what did you hear there from the NTSB chairman about the experience of the pilot, and why does that matter?
Well, the experience of the pilot matters because, like anything, you get better with skill. Your skills get better with practice, and the more you fly in the particular type of aircraft that you're flying, the better skills that you have. But what leapt out at me in that statement, now remember, this is the person in the right seat, but it's the pilot in command because he was the instructor. On any instruction flight, the pilot in command is the instructor. I was an aviation professor at Ohio State, and you know that's a very important point. But what they said next was just shocking, and that this was his first flight as the instructor. Now, good instructors, like teachers, you know, they aren't born, they're made. You have to learn how to be a good teacher, and this person was clearly not a good teacher with some of the things. I suspect you'll play more of the clip, but the next things that she said are equally shocking about him reaching over and adjusting the throttle, the airspeed, and apparently the pilot in the left seat, who's ordinarily the pilot in command, hadn't realized it. Terrible, terrible move.
Well, does it make a difference that these pilots had most experience with a different type of aircraft versus the 777?
Absolutely. It does make experience because every aircraft has a different, a different feel. For example, coming in, they had a 17-mile straight-in final, according to earlier reports from the NTSB. It wasn't in yesterday's conference, but that's a long time, and a good long time to set up your approach and get to the airport. And when you're, for example, coming over San Francisco Bay with the water and the heat brings moisture up, you're going to have a particular kind of sink rate. In other words, the rate of descent of your airplane is going to be a little different over warm water. And that's the kind of thing you get used to as you feel and get used to the plane. And Deborah Hersman said something else very interesting. She said that he'd had 10 legs. Not 10 trips, 10 legs. On any one trip, you might rack up 6 legs on a trip if you make a couple intermediate stops. And so that is not very much experience to have a plane load full of people and a first-time instructor. It's really quite a shocking pairing, frankly, for a 777 full of people on a 10-hour flight.
Well, who would have put that team together, and does anyone oversee who gets put together in the cockpit?
The airline. That's the airline's responsibility. The airline does have a chief pilot, someone who oversees the pilot training and the pilot checks and the check rides and getting everybody checked out on the right aircraft. And then, of course, because they're a Korean-flagged carrier, meaning that their aircraft and their airline are registered in Korea, they follow the Korean air regulations. So their airline has to follow the Korean air regulations, and then their chief pilot will assign various duties and training pairings.
When landing an aircraft, whose responsibility is it, the pilot or the tower?
The pilot. It is always the pilot, and it's the pilot in command. And that is whether you are on an instrument approach, an instrument landing, or you're doing a visual. Now, if you're on an instrument, of course, the tower gives you commands and you must obey them unless you have an emergency or ask for deviation from their instructions. But here that wasn't an issue. The pilot gave them a cleared for land with a visual approach, and at that point, the tower, barring an emergency, barring a wake turbulence warning, barring seeing other traffic converging on the flight, they don't have any further obligation to that particular flight.
What role do we know did the tower play in this? We've heard some recordings where the tower says you're coming in heavy. So what role did they play and what does that mean?
Well, air traffic controllers can be helpful. I mean, obviously their job is to separate traffic, keep them apart from each other, give them the correct information that's required or that's requested, and then also give them the proper instructions to get sequenced and get lined up for landing. The things that they told them were, of course, helpful, but it's up to the pilot to respond. And the pilot had a lot of cues, your airspeed indicator, your altitude. It turns out there were initial reports that those, they called PAPI or VASI lights. They're red and white lights that tell you if you're too high or too low or right on your glide slope. They were operational. And that's something you learn literally your first day in flying school. The lights are, it goes this way: red over white, you're all right, and red over red, you're dead. Of course, if you're white over white, you're way too high. And every pilot knows that, and apparently they had those lights. Why they didn't adjust sooner, well, the NTSB will find that out.
Well, here's the headline in the New York Times. We talked about the pilots. Their headline says, inquiry suggests chance that mechanical failure had a role in the crash. Matthew Wald reports the pilots of the Asiana jet that crashed here Saturday believed that they had set the auto throttles, devices that control the engines to maintain safe airspeed. But any speed fell to unsafe levels anyway. The chairwoman of the National Transportation Safety Board said on Tuesday.
That's right. Chairman Hersman did say that yesterday, that the pilot reported that he had set, now this would be the left seat pilot, that he had set the auto throttle and that the auto throttle should have held the airspeed to 137 knots, and then it fell about 30 below that to a dangerously slow level. However, there are a couple things at issue here. One, did they properly set it? And two, that would not excuse the accident, because remember, the instructor pilot, the pilot in the right seat, then adjusted the airspeed, noticed that it was low, and adjusted the airspeed to increase that, because then the pilot in the left seat said, well, I noticed the airspeed was low and I went to adjust the throttles. In other words, push give the more airspeed, push the throttles higher. And he said, and I noticed that the instructor had already done that. So that there is another example of terrible crew resource management, meaning they're not coordinating the cockpit. So if there was a problem with an auto throttle, the pilots had noticed it and they should have responded appropriately. There was one other thing that was mentioned, and nobody's talked about it, so I'm sure they must have done this, but there was an airworthiness directive on this plane, and it was for the air pressure transducers, which go into the air data control model. Now, I know that's a lot of gobbledygook, but the bottom line of that is there was a warning in January of 2013 that all operators of this 777 needed to check to see if their air data in their plane gave the correct altitude and airspeed. That had to be accomplished within 30 days, and that's another thing that might have given an erroneous airspeed indication, but that airworthiness directive had to be accomplished by February. So I'm sure they must have done that, and certainly Chairwoman Hersman would have mentioned that.
Well, if where did that directive come from? And the fact that this was not a U.S. company, do they have to listen to that sort of directive?
That you're absolutely right, right on. The airworthiness directives come from the Federal Aviation Administration. But companies that fly planes like Boeing and Airbus, major airlines, usually listen to them. Obviously, they're not bound by U.S. regulations, but they listen to them because airworthiness directives are not a subtle suggestion. Airworthiness directives mean, whoa, something here could be terribly wrong, and it's so important that we're making it an airworthiness directive that has the full force and effect of a regulation. It's that strong, it's that important. And here you had every incentive to do it, because if there was a problem with your air data indicators, the Honeywell would replace them. If it was more than 75 feet of difference, they had to take them out, and Honeywell would have given them new ones. So they had every incentive to go do it. So I suspect that they did. There would be no reason not to do that. And so that, and then a possible issue, according to the pilot, with the auto throttle holding airspeed, are just about the only mechanical even questions we've heard, and both of which should have been overcome by noticing you are way below your target airspeed and way low on your altitude.
Well, Rick Lundstrom on Twitter wants to know, how much of the 777 approach and landing sequence is automated?
Well, you know, the interesting thing, the NTSB has rightfully been very critical of pilots, saying they're losing their actual stick and rudder, you know, flying skills, hand-on flying skills, because everything is so automated. The 777 can do everything. The 777 can, it has such a wonderful autopilot system that it truly could have landed itself. But the instrument landing system on runway 28L at San Francisco, the one that they were using, was out. So they couldn't use the full autopilot land feature, because they didn't have the instrumentation that needed to provide it the correct data to get the auto glide slope and all of the data to do that. But, you know, it's funny, in an accident like this one, the autopilot might have saved it, would have saved it. And
well,
it would have made a difference.
So Mary Schiavo, I mean, then whose fault is that? If that instrument wasn't available to these pilots, is that the fault of the airport or the airline?
Well, you like to have your, I mean, obviously, you know, San Francisco's a big, you know, popular airport, and you like to have that system available, but there's something called a NOTAM, a Notice to Airmen. It's published by the Federal Aviation Regulation, and as a pilot, you are obligated to check the NOTAMs at the airports at which you are, you know, intending to land. And there had been a NOTAM out since June 2013, you know, a month before, that this system was out, and that it was going to be out for some time. I think the NOTAM expires in August. And so it was noticed that it was out, and the pilots, had they done proper flight preparation, would have known that and would have prepared for that. And so that's why they have NOTAMs. Pilot is obligated to know about that and plan the flight accordingly.
All right. Atlanta, Georgia, Al, Democratic caller, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning. Isn't it true that any time a domestic airline has a crash, the first thing that the FAA or whoever it is, authority, they ask for a drug test or alcohol test? That's in the rules. But yet any foreign airlines, such as the Korean, they are not given any kind of a drug test, alcoholic test, or whatever. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, and I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's a point with which I disagree with the current thinking. Now, aviation is governed by a series of treaties, and the right for foreign airlines to land here, and conversely for our airlines to land in foreign countries, are governed by a number of treaties, and that's what's called the fifth right of the fifth flying right, or the fifth freedom as they call it, and that's the right to fly in and out and land in other countries, pick up passengers and do business, but still be subject to the laws of your flag nation, in other words, where your airline's headquartered. However, when someone's involved in an accident in this country, be it an automobile, you know, a bicycle, we require them to be subject to testing and questioning and all sorts of investigation. But for us to just say, well, since you're a pilot from another country, you're not subject to drug and alcohol testing, I disagree. You're immune if you have diplomatic immunity, but pilots don't have that. Those treaties don't convey any sort of that immunity. And so while we take a hands-off on the regulation of pilots from other airlines, I think that should not be the case where they've been involved in an accident, particularly here for another reason. And that is that at least 2 U.S. carriers code share share onto Asiana. And when you code share onto Asiana, if there was any passenger on that plane that had purchased a ticket from the U.S. carrier, then the U.S. rule should apply because the ticket was sold under the United States. So if you're a foreign airline and you don't code share with any U.S. carriers and you don't have anything to do with U.S. Either carriers or passengers, et cetera, then I can see the point. But when that's not the case as here and you actually have code shares with U.S. carriers, U.S. passengers, a U.S. crash, I think we have every right to demand drug and alcohol testing. But a lot of aviation is political, and we get into many a diplomatic huff when we demand things of foreign airlines.
Mary Schiavo, former Inspector General at the Transportation Department, is our guest to talk about the Asiana airline crash and the subsequent investigation from the National Transportation Safety Board. Robert is up next in Jonesboro, Arkansas, independent caller.
Yes, good morning to both of you. 2 points here. First of all, I agree with the lady that we should have drug and alcohol tests for all pilots, even those from foreign nations. Second of all, it sounds to me like there's plenty of blame to go around, not just the pilots themselves, but it was a very complicated situation there involving the air traffic controllers, the airport, the airliners, and the pilots themselves. And it leads me to a conclusion here. Maybe the best solution for this airplane would have been for them to have landed safely on San Francisco Bay like the pilot did on Hudson Bay.
Mary Schiavo?
Well, you know, one thing we need to put in perspective is the number of visual flight rules landing. It is really quite common for passenger airliners to be given visual flight rule clearance by the tower. So it wasn't that unusual to get a clearance by the tower saying you're cleared to land, visual flight rules, and they accept it, because that happens a lot. In fact, there's a little bit of criticism, and I don't know that this is justified or the real reason, but some pilots claim that the towers like to give visual flight rule landings so they can stuff more traffic in the flight pattern. I don't believe that, but there's a criticism of them, of that, you know, of those commands. So I don't think it was an unusual situation for them to expect to have to land a plane manually or to use visual flight rules. And the problem in landing on water, and why we call it the miracle on the Hudson, is usually you don't have very good outcome. Captain Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles get something very unusual on their resume, and that's that they managed to do a successful water ditching. Most pilots aren't trained for that. Most pilots have never experienced. They happen to be military pilots and very experienced ones at that. So I think the outcome on a water landing actually would have been worse because we would have had more loss of life. And the you know, with the landing gear hitting that seawall, I mean, the difference is 75 feet, you know, would have made all the difference in the world. And they were way too low even without the seawall, because the point where they were touching down was a couple hundred feet before the actual runway indicators, the threshold of the runway and the numbers and the markings on the runway. So they were just way low and way slow all the way around.
Well, we're taking your questions, your comments on airline safety and this Asiana airline crash last week in San Francisco. Mary Schiavo, what do you make of this from the Washington Times this morning? Here is what it is known, is what they report. 7 seconds before impact, someone in the cockpit asked for more speed after apparently noticing that the jet was flying far slower than its recommended landing speed. A few seconds later, the yoke began to vibrate violently, an automatic warning telling the pilot the plane is losing lift and in imminent danger of stalling. 1.5 seconds before impact came a command to abort the landing.
Yes, and the timing there is just really tragic. Like I said, they got the final straight-in clearance 17 miles out. Initially, they were a little high, and they set for the rate of descent, et cetera. So what happened for those several seconds beyond that, you know, or minutes, is also a mystery which the NTSB will solve. But to not notice the problem until 7 seconds out, you know, a jet engine Takes a while to get up the speed. Now, they're very good. These are Pratt & Whitney engines. I mean, this is a state-of-the-art airplane, but it's not instantaneous. You don't notice that your airspeed is 107 knots and you're supposed to be 137 knots. You don't get 30 extra knots in a second. It has to, you know, take time to build that up. So at 7 seconds...
That the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, what do you get